So given our understanding of why productivity is different in different countries, let's revisit now the rich countries and the poor countries that we saw earlier today. And ask, a child growing up in a rich country, why do they end up with much higher income per person compared with a child growing up in a poor country? So, from our understanding, then, growing up in a rich country, you have a much better school system, much better schooling, much better training, and so you end up with a lot more human capital per person, better education, better training. Also, after you graduate from university, you go to work. You have access to all types of high-paying jobs in companies around you because of all that capital that exists in the society. Factories, office buildings, machinery, and not just that, but also the government roads, bridges, telecommunication system infrastructure. This allows the economy to provide these much higher paying jobs, this higher amount of capital per worker. And also, rich countries tend to be less densely populated than poorer countries, and they have more natural resources that also contributes to it. And they also have access to better technology compared with poor countries. So if you take someone born in a poor country and you move them to a rich country, giving them access to all these things, you move them when they're 3 months old, and they grow up there in the rich country, they have access to better schooling system, better training, universities, infrastructure, physical capital, and technologies, they end up earning higher salaries. Whereas you take someone from a baby born in one of these rich countries and you move them to a poor country, they grow up in a system with surroundings, with very little physical infrastructure, very, very little physical capital, low technology. Also, institutional structure is not there. You have corrupt governments, badly working governments, and bad schools. It means that you end up earning much less than if you were born into a rich country. So that's our explanation for why some countries are poor and some countries are rich. This list of factors that affect productivity per worker. What determines economic growth over time? Well, it comes down to how you can improve these factors. So let's have a look at these factors one by one. Firstly, human capital. Human capital is the education, training, skills embodied in the worker. It's what makes a worker be able to produce more. Even in the same type of job, some workers are more skilled and they can produce more. So this is human capital, and it remains to the worker. If the worker did not die, the human capital remains there, which partly explains why, after World War II, and a lot of countries, all of their physical capital and infrastructure had been destroyed. Europe, Japan, parts of China as well. They'd been bombed and physical infrastructure was destroyed. But the human capital was still there. And this enabled these countries to recover very quickly. So we had very high growth rates in Europe and in Japan and after World War II. And similarly, in Korea, after the Korean War was over, South Korea grew quite fast. Human capital is embodied in the worker. Now, this human capital, usually we measure it as the number of years of education per worker, a number of years of training per worker, and also a number of years of working per worker, because work experience also contributes towards the and productivity is higher when human capital per worker, or education and training per worker is high. Now, what can governments do in order to encourage economic growth, given that human capital per worker is important to higher incomes? Governments can try and encourage more education and training per worker so they can support or provide schooling. So in most countries around the world, schooling from kindergarten all the way to high school is provided for free by the government, because education is important for building a better workforce. Actually, the earlier schooling is the most important. So if you have a country where they have 0 years of schooling, and then you provide 3 years of schooling, people learn how to read and write and do basic arithmetic, huge impact on the workforce. And then you provide more years of schooling. Now they can write essays, and go to high school, they can do the things you do in high school, mathematics. You have another bump in the skills of the workforce, but not as big a bump as from primary school, where you learn to read and write basic math, basic arithmetic. And then universities, again, they add to skills, but not by as much as the high school did. So in many countries, universities not mandatory, although usually it's supported in part by the government. It's not free. In most countries, it's not free. And we know from looking at how much people earn that after you get your bachelor's, more education helps, but not by as much as before. And once you hit about 16 years or so of education, it peters out. So getting a PhD doesn't really help increase your earning power after that. So anyway, education, that's what we call positive externalities, in that it helps both the person being educated as well as the society as a whole. So in most countries, the government will support it or even provide it. Second, physical capital is also something that's important, that contributes towards higher incomes. Building up physical capital contributes towards economic growth. We call that capital accumulation. More savings, more investment builds up physical capital. Countries with higher savings and investment tend to grow faster. And we'll look at the savings and investment system next week. However, fiscal capital has diminishing returns, diminishing marginal returns. It's one of the properties of production function, diminishing returns. Much like human capital also has diminishing returns. I said that most of the benefit comes from primary school, and then secondary school. High school also contributes, but less. And college by less again. Once you hit the PhD level, it's kind of zero. Well, same idea for physical capital. Your first machine in there really increases production. Second one increases it. Third again, but less than before. Eventually, you keep on adding machines. It's not going to contribute to growth anymore. So we have a diminishing marginal return to capital, as well as to human capital. So there are limits to growth that comes from increasing capital, what we call capital accumulation. So in the very long run, growth depends on more than just accumulating human capital and physical capital. But having more investment, more capital accumulation does contribute to growth. And what we're looking at is capital per worker. So amount of capital in a country divided by the number of workers in the country, also called the capital labor ratio. when the capital labor ratio is higher, then productivity is higher as well. And this increase in productivity comes from an increase in capital labor ratios, especially large near the beginning returns. So poorer countries, when they start accumulating capital, they get a big push in growth. So this chart here just shows the amount of capital per worker and the GDP per worker, and it shows the general principle of the more capital per worker there is, the higher the GDP per worker, the output per worker. So more capital per worker allows workers to be more productive and allows higher GDP. So given that savings and investment and building up capital contributes towards economic growth, what can governments do? Well, they should try and encourage saving and investment. Saving is what finances investment. People save, they put money in the bank, and put that money that can be used to buy capital goods, to finance investment. So governments should try and encourage savings in order to encourage investment, in order to build up the capital and faster growth because of that. So governments do want to encourage savings. So in many countries, they have saving schemes, or it's part of the social welfare system. So for example, in the US, they have what they call IRAs, individual retirement accounts. It makes it tax-free to put money into that, encourages savings. In Hong Kong, we have this mandatory provident fund where part of your income, mandatory, it's by law, you need to put it into this NPF account. That forces savings. And China also, of course, we also have mandatory savings through the social welfare system. It's also, it looks like tax, but it's actually going to your own individual account. So that's forced savings. And governments can also use tax policy to encourage savings. For example, they might not tax interest payments, and that encourages savings. So in Hong Kong, for example, interest is tax-free, interest income is tax-free. Also, governments can encourage companies to invest by offering tax credits. That is, if you use the money for investment, you don't need to pay tax on that profit. So companies make a certain amount of profit. If you use that profit for investment, you don't need to pay tax on that as you normally would on profits. So that's also going to encourage investment. And governments can also directly increase the amount of physical capital in the country, usually in terms of infrastructure projects. So building roads, bridges, railways, subway systems like the MTR here in Shenzhen, telecommunications, internet, these are all the government building up the physical infrastructure. You can consider this to be government investment. But remember, for I investment, that's private investment. Government investment is part of government spending. But that can build up the physical infrastructure of the country as well. And in fact, for China, with very high infrastructure development from the government, we have seen very high growth rates. And some economists believe that this has been part of the secret recipe for China's high economic growth. That is, most countries, their governments don't invest enough in the physical infrastructure. And China is the exception. China is investing enough. So the system, the government system here encourages high infrastructure investment, and this has contributed towards economic growth here in China. But like I mentioned, we have diminishing returns to capital. So human capital, primary education is the most important. Then when you hit after your bachelor's, it's not going to much affect your value as a worker anymore. So diminishing returns to training and education, diminishing returns to capital, physical capital accumulation. One computer is good, two computers for the same person, not really necessary. Three is redundant, four is just a waste of space. Diminishing returns to capital. There's only so much economic growth you can get from capital accumulation. But when you don't have any capital at all, any additional capital really has a big effect. So that's the idea of diminishing capital. And because of this, we have, if you look at the output per worker will tend to go up, but the increase will slow down as you increase capital per worker. So if we look at the production function or the productivity function, actually, Y over L, productivity function, with respect to the capital labor ratio, it tends to curl downwards. Now, this has important implications for why poor countries tend to grow faster than rich countries. Think about it, right? So when workers have very little capital per worker, low capital labor ratio, any increase in capital increases productivity by a lot. When you have a lot of capital already, there's a high capital labor ratio, as exists in the rich countries. So rich countries have more capital per worker. That's why they're rich. You have a lot of capital per worker already, and the increase in capital has very little impact on increasing output per worker. So what does this mean? If you compare poor countries to rich countries, poor countries tend to have little capital per worker. So when they increase capital per worker, it's a big impact on their economic growth rates. And so they have high economic growth because of capital accumulation. Rich countries, they've already got a lot of capital per worker. Any additional capital per worker, any additional investment doesn't increase GDP by very much. So the high growth that is experienced is usually going to be experienced by the poorer countries. So they have, you can say, the opportunity to grow because of capital accumulation. So this capital accumulation growth is the opportunity that poor countries have to grow faster. And if we look at the experience of the East Asian countries, we often see that they experience maybe 30, 40 years of high growth during the period of capital accumulation. They start off poor and then they have capital accumulation growth, and they grow very fast. So this is what happened in Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, to some extent Malaysia as well, and now in Vietnam. These countries that start off relatively poor, and then they have high capital accumulation, they grow fast, and they've got 5, 6, 7, 10% growth rates, and then they become better off. Middle income countries, high middle income countries, and then their growth rates slow down. The growth rates slow down not because they've stopped being hardworking or they stopped being smart or something like that. Their growth rates slow down because they start looking more and more like rich countries. They have high capital per worker. And so their days of high capital accumulation growth is already behind them. So this is what we call the catch-up effect. Poor countries will tend to grow faster and catch up with the rich countries. So poor countries have this opportunity to grow fast. So poor countries have low capital per worker, they start here. Rich countries have high capital per worker, they start here. and poor countries have the opportunity to grow faster from capital accumulation, and they tend to catch up to the rich countries that don't have capital accumulation growth anymore. We also call this convergence. That is, countries' incomes tend to converge together. This we've seen convergence happen in the East Asian countries versus the developed countries over the last 50 years or so. East Asian countries start off poor and then they become rich very fast, and then their growth starts to slow down as they converge on a rich country. We've also seen this convergence effect, catch-up effect, in the various countries of the EU, of Europe. So you go back 60, 70 years, World War II or so. After World War II, some countries were, were bombed flat, almost completely destroyed. But they tended to grow faster, and then they kept up with the countries that were relatively rich. So you see convergence in European countries. You also saw convergence in the Eastern European countries. Eastern European countries were poorer than the Western European countries when the Soviet Union broke apart. And then when the Soviet Union broke apart, a lot of these Eastern European countries joined with the European community, the EU. And they tended to grow faster. Now the incomes have tended to equalize. So this catch-up effect it comes from the opportunity for poorer countries to accumulate capital, to experience capital accumulation. And this explains why the fastest growing countries in the world, the fastest growing economies in the world, are always relatively poor countries. And if you put your house in order, you get your good government in there, you do things right, you get good economic policies, if you're poor, you can really grow very fast. But it's a temporary growth period, quite long lasting, 20, 30, 40 years. But eventually, the growth rates will slow down. And we've actually seen pretty much the same thing here in China. You probably know that the growth rates in China have been slowing down for the last 5 years or so. Is it because the Chinese people are less hardworking now? No, it's because China is richer now than it was in 1985. So between 1985 and 2015, you have high growth rates, but now it's starting to slow down. We're seeing this catch-up effect of 85, 95, 2005, 2015, that's about 30 years or so of high growth. Still, maybe another 10 years of above average growth, but eventually the growth rates are going to reach the level of most countries around the world, which is about 3 to 5%. So the years of 10% growth are behind China. China has taken advantage of this capital accumulation period to become a middle income country. Okay, now another factor affecting differences in income per person is the amount of land and natural resources per person, per worker. And I mentioned that in the US, farms are huge. And so each farmer produces a lot of output per farmer, whereas in Bangladesh, farms are very small, so each farmer produces very little. So in the US, growing rice is just very, very productive for the rice farmer. It's really huge farm. Whereas in Japan, the farm is very tiny. So even though Japan has this, same technology as the US, their farmers are going to be less productive because they have less land per farmer. And the same for raw materials and natural resources. So some countries are rich because of their natural resources. Saudi Arabia, for example, they have petroleum, so they're rich. But you don't need natural resources to become rich. And we see this from countries that don't have very much natural resources and yet can become rich. So some countries in Europe, for example, Switzerland, for example, yeah, Switzerland is very rich, but it doesn't really have natural resources. Well, they have mountains. People like to go skiing there, but apart from that, not much. Singapore has almost no natural resource except the strategic location, so good for shipping. Same with Hong Kong, no natural resources except a good harbor. Japan has very little natural resources, and yet these are countries that became rich. So we don't need natural resources to become rich, can be imported as long as you build up your other factors like human capital and fiscal capital. So natural resources to work more is better in that it makes you richer. So Saudi Arabia has petroleum, Australia has minerals, US has land for their farms, it makes them rich. But there's a tendency for countries that are rich because of their natural resources to grow more slowly. So if you're rich because of your natural resources, you can't really add to that. It's not like physical capital and human capital. You don't have increasing technology in your physical capital, better technology for your factories, increasing trading and science and technology in your universities. Natural resources are just kind of there. And if there are not renewable natural resources like petroleum, then exploiting them will actually make you poorer in the future. This is called the natural resource curse. It's the observation that economists have made that countries that are rich because of their natural resources tend to grow more slowly than countries that are rich without natural resources. So your natural resources get depleted, they don't come back, you become poorer in the future.